right, I'm just a mean green mother from outer space, and I'm bad. I'm just a mean green mother from outer space, and it looks like you've been had.
Released in 1992 for MS-DOS, Alone in the Dark was published and developed by Infogrames, but was really spearheaded by one man named Frederick Renault. Renault was inspired by classic horror flicks by Dario Argento and George Romero for making his horror-themed adventure game. The initial plan was to have the game be depicted in full 3D, but unfortunately the engine couldn't handle everything being rendered as a polygon. After this, the team attempted to use real-life pictures as the backgrounds, tracing them over in a manner similar to rotoscoping. After this didn't pan out, they just resorted to using hand-drawn bitmaps. This led to the decision to have a static camera rather than a dynamic one, with a fixed camera angle showing off the pre-rendered backgrounds. The 3D polygon models could then be depicted moving over them to simulate a full 3D effect. And with that, a new genre was born. The game's story starts with the then current occupant of the Derceto mansion, Jeremy Hartwood, committing suicide, which motivates two others to head there. The player can then choose between one of these two to be the playable character: series lead Edward Carnby, the private detective, or Jeremy's niece, Emily Hartwood. Edward as an addition is a bit of an odd decision, considering that Emily is the character who has actual ties to the plot. The justification for Edward's inclusion is that he was hired to get some piano from the mansion for a client. Don't know about you, but the death of a loved one sounds like a more compelling motivation than knick-knack hunting. So I chose to play as Edward simply because he's the protagonist of the later games, though I did play a chunk of the game as Emily to compare them. Neither character has any real gameplay changes, but there are some minor animation differences between the two. It's nothing major, but the effort is welcome. The story itself is one of the first instances I can think of a video game just being straight up Lovecraftian with its subject matter, this and the lurking horror being the earliest. Unlike other popular examples of Lovecraftian games like Eternal Darkness and Bloodborne, which are just inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, Alone in the Dark uses all of the famous aspects of his writings. Cthulhu, Dagon, Abdul, Zarad, the works. The backstory is told through notes found around the mansion, and it takes the lion's share of the game's narrative. The backstory of the Derceto mansion, the man who created it, and the full story behind Jeremy's suicide is what the narrative is interested in exploring. It's interesting enough, and telling most of it through optional notes allows the player to easily skip it on repeat playthroughs. It's pretty much ideal for a game like this. Whenever the topic of Alone in the Dark is brought up, one of the first things you'll hear is how it directly shaped the survival horror genre, and more specifically acted as direct inspiration for the much more popular Resident Evil. Being frank, the influence on Capcom's game is very clearly apparent. From the fixed camera angles, slow combat, limited ammo, resource and inventory management, the power dynamic between the player and enemies, and adventure game style puzzles and progression, just to name a few aspects. Hell, Resident Evil even took the mansion setting over top an awful underground secret and the famous window break jump scare. It's impressive just how many of the defining traits of the survival horror genre were done all at once just for this one game, many of these for the first time. While not the first horror game, Alone in the Dark certainly is the first 3D and full-fledged survival horror game. That distinction means that it does deserve a great deal of respect. However, it cannot blind us to the areas where it has not aged well at all. Namely, the controls leave a lot to be desired. I'm not talking about the tank controls present here either, which are actually very responsive for the first time they've ever been implemented in a game. No, the problems here are the action commands and running. The game has 4, and then later on 5 action commands: fight, open search, close, and push. Selecting one of these puts your player character into the given mode to push a cabinet, search a desk, and so on. To select one, you have to go into your inventory, select the action command, and then the action you want to take. To perform the action, you have to hold or press the spacebar. It's clunky having to go in and out of a menu just for simple action commands, and honestly, just having key bindings for each of these would have been a very nice addition, but it's not too bad overall. What's worse is the running, which is done not by holding a key, but by double tapping the up arrow key and holding it. You'll run indefinitely as long as you're in motion, but if you're stopped for any reason, you'll have to double tap again. This really should have just been a key binding or even a selectable action command working within the game's limits, because as is, breaking into a run is a bit of a pain to pull off in a pinch. Getting back to the inventory, Alone in the Dark has a huge problem with its system, because while you have an unlimited inventory theoretically, there's an undisclosed item weight limit. If you carry too much, you'll become encumbered. The only real way to avoid this is to dump anything in your inventory you don't actually need, which you fortunately can do at any time. You can put down any item anywhere, and you can always pick it up at the exact same spot later on. Kind of like how the inventory worked in Resident Evil 0, come to think of it. How you're supposed to know what you will and won't need for your inventory on your first playthrough, that's anyone's guess, really. The combat is serviceable, especially when you consider that it's the first attempt at fighting in a survival horror game. The weapons range from some melee options like swords and knives, a couple of guns, or you can just drop all of those and punch the monsters to death. Damn, STARS members don't have shit on Ed Carnby. Melee attacks, both with weapons and your fists, have 3 types of moves. 2 different swings or hooks by holding left or right on the arrow pad, or 1 special attack by holding either up or down interchangeably. The safest bet is always the use of firearms, however, and how guns work here is similar to how Resident Evil would do it 4 years later. There isn't a direct lock-on while aiming, so you have to manually point the gun at the enemy, and frankly the delay between each shot is a bit much. The enemy variety present is nice as well, with a decent number of unique enemies to each part of the house. There are zombies, werewolf things, deep ones, a pirate who you have to sword duel to death, ghosts, and a giant spider. However, bar none, the worst enemies are the invincible ankle-biting rats and spiders, which act more as nuisances than genuine threats. Also, without showing it, the final boss is more of a puzzle than a real fight, so just keep that in mind. Frankly, the random events will kill you more than the enemies. In Alone in the Dark, you can be killed by, among other things, reading a book, flashing lights, walking out the front door, and a purple plant monster in the bathroom. There isn't any real way to know when something innocuous could just up and kill you. To combat this, the game fortunately allows you to save at any time you feel like and use multiple slots, so save often and make sure you rotate them. The level design is pretty solid as well, with Drusetto Manor feeling like a smaller version of the Spencer estate from Resident Evil. The house is designed in a realistic manner that an actual large house may be laid out in, which is large enough to allow for running back and forth to complete puzzles, but small enough to have its layout be easily memorable. Having certain shortcuts locked off with keys also gives the game a decent sense of progression before the game's subterranean climax, unlocking all of them really giving you a sense of conquering the house. The setting of an old plantation manor in the middle of rural Louisiana also provides a nice isolated atmosphere, and it also could have been another possible influence on a Resident Evil game. In this regard, Drusetto is actually pretty similar to the Baker estate from Resident Evil 7. Getting away from the positive aspects of the game, I found the end game of Alone in the Dark to be pretty weak overall. Once you leave the house and enter the underground caves, the quality takes a bit of a dip. For instance, the game adds a jump action command out of nowhere and fails to inform you of this. It's only a momentary issue, but some kind of prompting would have been appreciated, or at least having the ability to jump be available from the beginning of the game. Then again, that also would have opened a programming can of worms, so maybe just not having the jumping segments present instead? Who knows, but it's also disappointing how the level design essentially becomes a straight line for the final stretch. Unlike the house, which felt pretty deliberate in its layout, the hallways of the caves only occasionally have a circle one could follow, or a branching path that leads to a dead end. Although I'd take this uninspired level design over the dark maze immediately following it. You traverse through a maze with only a small light cone around the player character like it's a Pokemon game, with the only light source being available being a lantern that's expending gasoline the entire time. It's only really a pain if you used gasoline poorly up until that point, and at the very least the game is living up to its title. You are alone in the dark after all, but it feels a bit lazy. The challenge here is just throwing you into a dark room and telling you to find a way out, which is a touch weak compared to the care and balancing that went into everything that came before it. It's a weak ending, certainly, but at least it provided another thing for Resident Evil to imitate. When talking about the game's visuals, there's really no getting around it. Alone in the Dark looks dated today. However, when looking at it in the context of its release, nothing else really compared to the use of 3D models at the time, and the use of pre-rendered backgrounds allowed for the models to be as high quality as they are. Or were, at least. This is an instance of a technical limitation working in the game's favor, as the hand-drawn backgrounds look nice, but also have an issue with occasionally hiding doors from the player's view. Good old-fashioned wall hugging will solve this problem, but the implementation of fixed angles was something improved upon by later survival horror games. The music's alright and sets the atmosphere well enough, though it isn't anything all too memorable. The real star of the audio work though is the voice acting. The actors fit into the 90s PC gaming voice acting conventions of incredible ham and overacting, and they are great. Just listen to this gonzo stuff.
Let he who knows how to invoke the stones act. It is time. Let the shadow of Cthulhu darken the sky. May the servitor of the black goat of the woods with 1,000 youngs sound his flute in honor of the unspeakable. Cthulhu Fatang! Cthulhu Fatang! Ayah! Ayah!
I've always got a kick out of voice performances like this, because you can tell while the actors may not be the best, they sound like they actually care about what they're saying. At least they're doing a good job of fooling me. Also, just a personal preference, but I feel like the silly overacting kind of fits the overwrought style of a lot of Lovecraft. It's kind of like the vocal equivalent to that campy silent black and white Call of Cthulhu flick that came out in 2005. The style fits the material. Alone in the Dark holds up fairly well as a quality survival horror game in its own right, though it'll be hard to recommend it across the board considering that it shows its age fairly heavily. I give it a thumbs up for fans of the genre or for those who find playing historically significant games for themselves to be a worthwhile endeavor. For everyone else, I'd use this comparison. I'd say Alone in the Dark is to Resident Evil what Wolfenstein 3D is to Doom. It's a significant and well-made stepping stone that led to a much bigger and much better successor. Alone in the Dark would have 2 immediate sequels released in 1993 and 1994 respectively, but they're made on the same engine and possess essentially the exact same game mechanics as the first game, give or take a few tweaks. Not to mention, from what I've played, the horror aspect of the first game took a significant step back to make way for more lighthearted swashbuckling adventures in the sequels. It's for this reason that I'm not going to review the sequels because they're really not survival horror games anymore, and they play just too similarly to the first game. If you're interested in hearing about them, I'd recommend looking into the reviews done from Michael's Retro Game Reviews. He looks at the entire series as well, and does a pretty damn fine job of it. The sequels do have their own charm, and any game that has a scene like this is just too adorable to dislike. You can usually pick up the entire trilogy for dirt cheap on GOG sales, so give them all a whirl if a full 3D adventure game sounds like your kind of bag.